Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 11 of season 5 of Babylon 5, Phoenix Rising. Even more Cyclops arrive on the station to augment the Bloodhound units already present under Bester's command. His morning briefing details Byron's group as number 1, on hunger strike and contained. He isn't particularly worried about them. Group 2 is more of a concern, being mobile and having recently raided an armoury for PPG rifles and handguns. Bloodhound units are tracking them and he assumes they are poorly organised, an assumption we see being proved wrong as the Bloodhound corners a female telepath who is far less alone than the Bloodhound thought. Bester assigns a Cyclop to each Bloodhound unit, stressing the wayward children to be brought in alive if at all possible, and using the core is mother, core is father mantra. Lockley watches on, telling Bester that whilst he might, as he says, be there to protect normals from rogues, she doesn't like his methodology or his enjoyment of the hunt. He is then forced to eat his words about being the same as the rogues, as the travel tube they are waiting for opens on his Bloodhound unit strung up with the words "Free Byron" daubed on its wall. Bester's aim of clearing the problem by the next morning may be overly optimistic. Byron on Channel 4. Little huzzah from the British fandom of the time, as that was the channel the show was broadcast on over here. Byron wants the Cyclops gone so he can try and talk his people down, but Bester chooses that moment to join Lockley and Sheridan on the call. Bester is Bester. Stay put, we dig you out. Leave, we arrest you. He says Byron doesn't keep his promises. How would he know? In any event, with bodies on the ground, Bester promises that even the liberal Sheridan won't get in the way of the hunt now. Byron suggests there are other ways and terminates the conversation. Leader asks him what Bester meant, but leaves it later to explain. Sheridan and Lockley can't do much, and Sheridan wonders what Garibaldi is up to with Bester on the station. Lockley hasn't heard from him, and that worries Sheridan. A lot. As it should, because he has Bester banged to rights as he returns to his quarters. He demands Bester record a confession using the Babcom unit, otherwise he'll kill him for what he did to him and Sheridan. When Bester refuses, it's apparent he's gaming Garibaldi, and Garibaldi finds himself literally unable to pull the trigger, despite trying to. Bester asks him just how stupid he thinks he is, with him knowing what he knows and running loose. Mr. Garibaldi has been hit with an Asimov, a derivation of Asimov's 3 rules of robotics. Garibaldi has been hard-coded not to hurt Bester and not to allow Bester to come to harm. He is mentally unable to complete a physical action that would result in Bester coming to harm. It doesn't, however, stop him from blowing the hell out of the Babcom unit after Bester's departure, and as counterpoint, Bester left his rage intact. In Brown Sector, Lita doesn't let Byron off the hook on his apparent connection to Bester, and he warns her she won't like the answer. We finally get a crucial piece of his backstory. Like Lita, he was Psy-Corps born and bred, but he was rated a strong P12, which meant he was automatically a Psychop, and not just any Psychop, Bester's protege, and for a time he was just that. But then came a day when the Black Omega Squadron had locked down a transport taking blips to the outer colonies. With the blips secured, Bester decided that they needed to send a message, but he also wanted Byron bloodied. Whilst initially refusing to fire on the unarmed transport containing only mundanes, Bester made it clear that what the consequences would be for Byron in not following his orders, so Byron had no choice but to join in the slaughter. Reporting the incident afterwards resulted in nothing happening, so Byron resolved to break away and find a different way for his people, who know his background. He gave them strength, and in return they give him strength. Group 2 is pinned down by security and decides to capture mundanes as hostages, which unfortunately leads them to Medlab and both Garibaldi and Franklin. With the latter knocked out and the former banged up trying to hold the room, the telepath leader wants to speak to the President and Lockley, having ended up with very high value hostages. Their demands get broadcast out, and Byron is determined to get to what Lita thought was Medlab 1. Mundanes or not, he will not have killing in his name. The telepaths pull Peter, the wounded telekinetic, out of Medlab, and over Franklin's objections, use him to guard a major access corridor against Zack's troops. Bester remains confident that his authority is absolute, and unfortunately, given the 2-hour timescale imposed on them, Lockley is not going to hear back from Earthdome in time to be in a position to countermand that authority. So for the time being, his way is the only option, and Sheridan knows Lockley is as stuck as he is. Lita uses her enhanced powers to send her mind's eye down potential escape paths that might have been missed. After several dead ends, she finds a clear path for herself and Byron to leave their sealed-in area of the station. As they make their way past Peter unchallenged, Garibaldi is trying to convince the telepaths in Medlab that killing innocents is not going to win people over to their cause. With little time remaining, Sheridan comes on Babcom just behind Garibaldi to announce that the ISA cannot negotiate with terrorists, because once that door is opened, it can never be closed. So the choice is surrender or be taken down. They have 10 minutes. The telepath leader raises his PPG against Garibaldi and a shot rings out as Byron shoots his fellow telepath down. Sheridan paces as he and Lockley wait for a response. Sheridan notes that Garibaldi has been on the station the longest of all the command staff despite his personal problems, getting shot and stabbed and everything else. Sheridan will never forgive himself if he's now the one who's gotten him killed. Lockley reassures him that he's made the only choice, just as Byron comes on screen with a compromise to resolve the situation. Those telepaths guilty of causing harm will surrender to Lockley, not Bester. The rest must be released. Byron will give proof the guilty are not being released. He simply asks for a little time with his people before the surrender. While Sheridan and Lockley agree to this, Bester is furious, despite the fact that he'll probably be able to get some of the telepaths eventually. He is nevertheless officially unable to intervene at this point, because Earthdome has now given jurisdiction to the station above Psycor. It's apparent that this is unlikely to sit well with him, of course, even before Zack arrives with identity cards and signed confessions that Sheridan accepts, as Byron holding up his end of the bargain. And so Bester half recreates Lita's skill, literally taking the gloves off as he reaches out to Byron telepathically to try and steer him onto another path as he is saying his goodbyes. For Bester, the only way is Cora's father and mother, but Byron says that won't be the case after today, and the Mundanes will know of Bester's actions. As Lita arrives to collect him, the connection is broken, but a member of Group 2 had at least an idea of what was happening. Bester remains determined not to let Byron get away. That determination comes to a head as Bester interrupts what was going to be a peaceful handover as agreed. One of the Group 2 telepaths panics at the sight of the Cyclops and fires first, resulting in an exchange of fire that results in casualties and a chemical spill. As Byron is wounded and the computer voices a warning, Lockley calls a ceasefire, and Byron realises it's gone too far. Too much blood has been spilled for them to go back. He retrieves a PPG and asks Lita now what he asked her to once before, to leave him behind in the name of their love. He says, "You can't save my life, but you can save my soul." They embrace and she leaves them. Byron tells her not to look back. As she reaches Sheridan and Lockley, the Group 2 telepaths approach Byron and he takes aim at the chemical spill as Sheridan orders everyone out. Byron shoots and a fireball engulfs the telepaths. Bester seems to genuinely not understand how it came to this. He thought they just needed guidance back to the core. Sheridan can't understand why he doesn't get it. Bester always thought the conflict would be with Mundanes, not with his own telepaths. As he leaves, Franklin comes in and asks Sheridan about Garibaldi, as he was concerned about his questions and state of mind as regards his neural block inquiries. Lita sees the peaceful telepaths off the station and gives each of them, with Bester watching on, memories from Byron with details of contacts and safe houses and, looking at Bester, secrets, so that tomorrow they can start again. Bester takes his leave. Garibaldi is indeed at a low ebb, and as it seems the Remember Byron movement has already struck at Psycor headquarters based on a news report, he opens a bottle of liquor, pours himself a glass, and drinks. So here we are halfway through the season, and Byron's dream goes up in smoke. Literally at least, figuratively not so much. Many in the fandom did loathe his arc, let's not beat about the bush. But the reveal in this episode is really good and explains very clearly why Bester is quite so obsessed about getting his hands on Byron. It's a personal betrayal. More than that, it's almost a metaphysical betrayal, because he's betrayed not just Bester and by extension the core, but everything the core ever tried to drill into him. Worse still, his end and the end of Group 2 is a classic martyrdom scenario, although the report suggesting a Remember Byron movement has already lashed out is perhaps a bit much inside this episode. Give it a while, sure, but that seems a little obvious. As too did Franklin's signposting that Garibaldi seemed really disturbed, because I didn't think that was how he was acting in MedLab. Looking for a solution isn't the same as giving up. There's also the issue of Lita giving the telepaths their marching orders in full line of sight and earshot of Bester. That's just showboating. Granted, yes, she can block him, that's been established before now, and presumably she effectively tight-beamed the information from Byron to the telepaths who were leaving, but again, doing that right in front of Bester just seems reckless, because she's making them massive targets of opportunity for him. All very odd. Yet also very symbolic, of course, as was her introduction of Remember Byron to the cause, a switch up from Free Byron at the start of the episode. These points aside, it's a well-balanced Bester episode, although, again, I feel like Franklin was oddly sidelined and was just in the line of fire so Garibaldi could save him and be incentive to try and go up against the telepaths with his fists. We see another new Lita ability, perhaps call it Farsight? Byron doesn't even attempt to try it himself, so presumably it's exclusively hers. Peter returns with his telekinesis, although it's interesting that all he really does is chuck debris at Zack. Possibly he's too weak to try and do anything to the security guards directly. You can imagine that today he could take their guns off them using modern effects, then point them back at them or similar for threat value. Ironically, he's more powerful than Magneto, in the sense that he can also chuck plastic at people. There's also a nice moment with him and Byron where he clearly just wants to help. He's not inherently violent at all. The more gung-ho telepaths are a touch irritating, and they don't really seem to use their telepathic powers, resorting instead to gunplay, which seems short-sighted. It's still quite surprising, however, to have Byron gun down one of his own in defence of a mundane when he's supposed to be anti-violence, full stop. It's indicative of just how far the situation has gone out of his control, and I wonder if JMS is trying to send a message about pacifism here. Yet Bester himself is oddly enough not wanting to harm his fellow telepaths. He really wants to rehabilitate them. He's almost like a preacher trying to bring his wayward flock back into the fold. His refusal to properly back down in the face of Earth Dome orders also shines a light on just how far he thinks he can push things as a member of the Corps. He seems perhaps the most lost we've ever seen him in the aftermath, although like Franklin, I somehow feel like this was a somewhat diluted version of Bester. I can't quite say why. That being said, he is very much his usual self when dealing with Garibaldi. The Asimov is a terrific idea, and as you may well be, I was very familiar with this concept as soon as Bester indicated that that was what he'd done to him. I grew up on Isaac Asimov books once I graduated from Nicholas Fisk, and the 3 laws of robotics have been recycled a great many times, here in such a way that Garibaldi can definitely harm a telepath that isn't Bester, but Bester is off limits, and he'd have to save him if he could. It doesn't mean he can't think about doing it, mind you. It just means he can't take physical action himself, or not take physical action when the situation arrives. The terrible knock-on effect of this is, of course, that for the first time in a long time, Garibaldi hits the booze again. But it's obvious why. He's not in charge of his own mind. What does that do to a person? Worse still, of course, Bester is right there to rub his nose in it, which is played out to great effect in the scene. That alone is probably worth the price of admission for this particular episode. Byron's connection with Bester is a fascinating revelation this late in his arc, and does help to explain just why Bester pushes so hard this time round. He just doesn't grasp how anyone could stray so far from the path having started out on it, under his own tutelage no less. It's actually a shame in a sense that we don't have more time for that to be considered, but it does fit in with the rapid pacing of this episode as it builds to the climax. Although Byron may be gone, it's very clear from his speech to Lita and her subsequent exchange with the more peaceful telepaths that she is going to take over his movement, and she's also sending Bester a very clear message right in front of him that that's what she's doing. And given she's been known to deny Bester by blowing up worlds before now, this really ought to give him pause for thought. It also means that whilst the Byron plotline is resolved for now on the station, its repercussions are probably going to be longer lasting than we might have thought. Garibaldi's prior alcoholism is mentioned by Sheridan when speaking to Lockley, probably to help newcomers appreciate the full significance of him taking a drink at the end of the episode, in private, with a full bottle available to him. Given his relationship with alcohol, this is clearly not going to be a positive development for him, and the old hands will recall exactly how far south things went the last time he had a relapse. He is now in a role with much greater responsibilities, so we'll have to see whether this is something he can pull himself back out of again. Whilst you can't say it's a nice ending to the episode, it clearly flags to the viewer that a telepath conflict isn't the only one that's brewing. A couple of other mop-up points. Lockley's hair. Good lord, how much of it is there in profile? Just had to get that out of my system. Byron shooting a PPG at a pool of something. So it goes boom, but I wonder if it goes boom in the right way in an enclosed spinning space station. Not sure what the physics would do to a fireball in that sort of scenario. I imagine pressure doors would come down hard and fast to starve the fire out, because a lack of oxygen for things that breathe it would be a deeply bad thing in space. Indeed, we saw in The Gathering that that's the protocol, but I get the impression here it was cut for cost or speed or both. Finally, in the opening shots, something happens that I don't think we've ever seen before. The Psychor transport fires retro thrusters to slow its approach to the landing bay. Just a small detail, but I don't think we've ever seen that given a glow effect before, which is probably why I noticed it. I stand to be corrected. So, as the United Kingdom begins a new era under a new monarch, I enter into the last half of the last season of Babylon 5. For now at least. The reboot appears to be alive, and there is also news of another project involving the surviving original cast for 2023, which has already been completed. But JMS is giving nothing away on its nature. My money's on interpretive dance, personally. In any event, Phoenix Rising is certainly an appropriate title for all these events. I'll see you for the next one.